On West 23rd Street, between 7th and 8th Avenues, stands a 12-story Victorian Gothic fortress, the Hotel Chelsea. For a century, America's most notorious artists' colony. Home to Mark Twain, Arthur Miller, Bob Dylan, and Janis Joplin. A sanctuary where masterpieces were written and lives were destroyed. Its signature wrought iron balconies became stages for rock and roll excess. Its hallways a gallery of traded rent. A creative utopia built not on rules, but on the radical, dangerous idea of absolute freedom. The air on West 23rd Street tastes of exhaust fumes and the cold promise of rain. It's just after midnight, and the city's pulse has slowed to a low, electric hum, a sound that gets inside your bones. And there it is, the Hotel Chelsea. The neon sign, a slash of defiant red against the bruised purple sky, doesn't just announce a name. It broadcasts a mythology. It is an edifice of contradictions, a 12-story archive of genius and despair written in queen and brick and ornate. Wrought iron balconies that curl like scorched lace. From this distance, under the forgiving glow of the streetlights, it looks beautiful, grand. A fortress of Victorian imagination standing firm against the glass and steel modernity that surrounds it. But get closer. Let your eyes trace the lines of the facade, the darkened windows that stare back like vacant eyes. You begin to feel the weight of it. Not the physical weight of a million bricks, but the immense, crushing gravity of the stories trapped inside. This was never just a building. It was a sanctuary and a laboratory. It was a refuge for those exiled from the mainstream, and a crucible where creativity was fired in the kiln of personal chaos. For every masterpiece conceived in its rooms, a dozen souls were lost in them. For every anthem written, a scream was swallowed by the thick plaster walls. The central paradox of the Chelsea is not that art and suffering coexisted here. It is that they were so deeply, inextricably intertwined, like lovers locked in a fatal embrace. Was the building a muse, or was it a predator? A silent witness to the beautiful, terrible process of creation and self-destruction, or an active participant, its very atmosphere a catalyst for both. The sign flickers. The wind carries the distant wail of a siren. The building waits, as it always has, indifferent to the questions. It holds the answers, but its walls, which have seen everything, will never, ever speak. To step inside the Chelsea today is to experience a carefully curated haunting. The lobby is pristine, a masterclass in boutique restoration. The air is clean, perfumed with something expensive and anonymous. The chaotic, sprawling collage of resident art, the paintings, sculptures, and assemblages that once covered every inch of the walls like a second skin, is gone. In its place are a few choice pieces, elegantly framed, spotlit with the precision of a museum. The famous grand staircase still sweeps upwards, but it feels less like a path to bohemian heaven and more like a set piece. It is beautiful, quiet, controlled, but this silence is a lie. This polished tranquility is the most profound desecration of all. Because the true lobby, the one that lives in legend, was a cacophony. It was a living, breathing organism, a public square, and a private asylum. It was the nerve center of a vertical village, populated by poets and hustlers, rock stars and runaways, painters who paid their rent with canvases, still wet to the touch, and playwrights hammering out dialogue over the relentless ringing of the switchboard. The air then was thick with the smells of oil paint, marijuana, and desperation. The floor was a mosaic of cigarette burns and spilled wine. Stanley Bard, the benevolent feudal lord of the strange kingdom, would hold court from behind his desk, deciding who was worthy of a key, trading a room for a song, a sculpture, a promise. The building's currency was talent and eccentricity, not credit scores. To sanitize this space is to fundamentally misunderstand what it was. It was not a hotel. It was an idea, a dangerous, intoxicating, and ultimately unsustainable idea that a community could be built not on rules and regulations, but on the volatile bedrock of raw, untethered human creativity. And as you stand in the calm of the new lobby, you can't help but ask, what was the price of that freedom, and what have we lost in our rush to clean up the mess? It was not born this way. The chaos was an accident, a deviation from a far more orderly and ambitious dream. To understand the Chelsea, you must go back to its conception, to 1884, a New York of gas lamps and horse-drawn carts, a city exploding with the grotesque wealth of the Gilded Age. While titans of industry like Carnegie and Vanderbilt erected palaces to their own egos on Fifth Avenue, a different kind of visionary was at work on the then fashionable West 23rd Street. His name was Philip Hubert, an architect with the soul of a socialist reformer. He saw the city's greed, its brutal division between the masters of capital and the huddled masses, and he envisioned an alternative. The Chelsea was not designed to be a transient hotel. It was conceived as one of the city's first luxury cooperative apartment buildings. More than that, it was a utopian experiment, a physical manifestation of the ideas of the French philosopher Charles Fourier. Hubert believed that by bringing together people from different walks of life, artists, writers, merchants, professionals, under one roof, with shared amenities and a collective ownership structure, he could foster a community that was both artistically vibrant and economically just. The building itself was his argument. The thick, soundproofed walls were designed to give creative tenants the privacy they needed. The soaring 12-story height, made possible by its sturdy iron frame, offered apartments with abundant natural light. The artist studios on the top floor, with their magnificent double-height ceilings and north-facing windows, were not an afterthought but a foundational element of the design. It was a purpose-built sanctuary for the creative spirit, an architectural declaration of war against the city's atomizing loneliness. It was a beautiful idea, a noble idea, and like most beautiful, noble ideas, it was doomed from the start. Hubert's vision was intricate, a society in miniature. The Chelsea was to be a self-contained world, a phalanstery, as the Fourierists would call it. The design was a testament to this grand social engineering. He planned for communal dining rooms to encourage social interaction, rooftop gardens for quiet contemplation, and a robust internal infrastructure that would serve the collective. The apartments themselves ranged in size from modest single-room dwellings to sprawling 10-room suites, ensuring a mix of economic classes. This was radical. In an age defined by rigid social stratification, the Chelsea proposed a model where a painter and a banker could be neighbors, sharing the same elevator, their lives intersecting in the hallways. The very architecture promoted this ideal. The famous iron balconies, which would later become stages for rock and roll excess, were intended as exterior corridors, places for residents to mingle, to breathe the air together, to form the bonds of a true community. Hubert wasn't just building apartments, he was building a new way of living. He believed that the physical environment could shape human behavior, that good design could foster good citizenship. He poured everything into this belief, from the fireproof construction, a novelty at the time, to the elegant finishes that gave the building its air of permanence and prestige. He was building a fortress, not against invaders from the outside, but against the corrosive spiritual decay of modern urban life. It was a machine for living, engineered to produce not profit but art, community, and a more equitable society. The dream was so compelling, so perfectly rendered in brick and mortar, that for a brief time, it seemed it might actually work. The machine, however, required constant fuel, and the fuel was money. Hubert's utopian cooperative was built on the shaky ground of Gilded Age finance. The initial residents, a mix of artists, writers like Mark Twain, and middle-class professionals, bought into the dream. They owned a piece of the fortress. But the dream was expensive to maintain. The building's grand scale meant grand operating costs, and the delicate ecosystem of mixed incomes was vulnerable to the slightest economic tremor. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, financial pressures mounted. A series of economic downturns strained the resources of the resident shareholders. The collective spirit began to fray under the relentless pressure of bills and maintenance fees. The final blow came with the financial panic of 1905. The cooperative, unable to weather the storm, collapsed. The dream was foreclosed upon. The building was sold, and its original purpose was irrevocably altered. It was converted into a hotel. The great experiment was over. The sanctuary for a permanent community became a way station for a transient population. This was the building's original sin, the moment its soul was sold. The fortress designed to protect artists from the whims of the market was now entirely subject to them. And yet, something of Hubert's vision lingered. It was embedded in the very bones of the place, in the thick walls that still offered silence, in the light-filled studios that still beckoned to creators. The building had lost its intended function, but it had retained its character. And it was this character, this ghost of a failed utopia, that would attract a new kind of resident, not shareholders in a collective, but spiritual tenants drawn to the promise of a place that was, and always would be, different. For nearly half a century, the Chelsea operated as a respectable, if slightly eccentric, hotel. But its second act, its transformation into the legend we know today, began in the 1940s when it was purchased by a consortium of garment industry magnates, including the father of a young man named Stanley Bard. After the death of his father, Stanley took over management in the late 1950s, and it was under his unique stewardship that the hotel's bohemian mythology truly took root. Stanley was not a conventional hotelier. He was something else entirely. A patron, a curator, a gatekeeper, and, most importantly, an enabler. He understood that the Chelsea's value was not in its threadbare carpets or its creaky plumbing, but in the intangible aura of creativity that clung to its walls. He made a radical business decision. He would cultivate that aura. He began to operate the hotel less like a business and more like a private arts foundation. He developed an almost supernatural intuition for spotting talent, or at least for spotting the kind of magnificent, doomed personalities that generate legends. He let artists pay their rent with their work, turning the lobby and hallways into a chaotic, ever-changing gallery. He offered rooms to struggling writers on little more than a promise. He protected his tenants from the outside world, from bill collectors, from the police, from their own worst impulses. He was the eye of the hurricane, the calm center around which the creative chaos swirled. He created an environment with almost no rules, a sanctuary where the only requirement for entry was the spark of artistic ambition. He was building on Hubert's dream, but twisting it into something wilder, more dangerous, and infinitely more compelling. Hubert wanted to protect artists from the world. Bard invited the world's chaos inside and gave it a key. The social structure that emerged under Bard's reign was a bizarre, vertical ecosystem, a perfect cross-section of the creative world's food chain. This was the new upstairs/downstairs dynamic, a hierarchy based not on wealth or class, but on fame, talent, and sheer survival instinct. On the upper floors, in the spacious apartments Hubert had designed for the well-heeled, lived the established giants. Playwright Arthur Miller took refuge here after his explosive marriage to Marilyn Monroe ended, seeking the anonymity of the hotel's long corridors. Composer Virgil Thomson held court for decades, his apartment a salon for the city's intellectual elite. These were the alphas, the ones who had made it. They paid their rent on time, but they were just the visible peak of the pyramid. Below them, in the warren of smaller rooms and suites, lived the invisible army, the hundreds of aspiring painters, poets, musicians, and filmmakers who had come to the Chelsea as if on a pilgrimage. They were the engine of the hotel's mythology. They lived on the edge, fueled by coffee, cheap wine, and the desperate hope that proximity to greatness was transferable. They filled the hallways with the sounds of guitars and typewriters, the smells of turpentine and poverty. It was a place of extreme juxtapositions. A world-famous artist might share an elevator with a penniless musician who hadn't eaten in 2 days. A Pulitzer Prize-winning author could nod good morning to a drug dealer in the lobby. This intense, often volatile mix was the secret to the Chelsea's alchemy. It was a high-stakes social experiment where genius and madness were thrown into the same cage, forced to interact, to collaborate, to feed off one another's energy until something new and brilliant, or something broken and tragic, emerged. The building itself seemed to conspire in this experiment. It was not a passive container. It was an active participant, a living, breathing character with its own personality and pathologies. Decades of deferred maintenance had turned it into a magnificent ruin. The plumbing was a labyrinth of groaning pipes that could deliver scalding water or a rusty trickle with no warning. The electrical system was a fire hazard, a tangled web of ancient wiring that hummed with a life of its own. The elevators were temperamental beasts, prone to stopping between floors, trapping residents for hours in their wrought iron cages. But these flaws were not seen as defects. They were part of the Chelsea's charm, shared hardships that bonded the tenants together. The hotel's infrastructure extended beyond the physical. The bellhops were more than employees. They were fixers, confidants, and often dealers. The switchboard operators, plugging and unplugging cables in a scene out of a 1940s film noir, knew every secret. They were the keepers of the building's oral history, connecting lovers, screening calls from angry dealers, and listening in on the dramas that unfolded behind closed doors. And then there was the art. It was everywhere. It covered the walls of the lobby, it lined the stairwells, it spilled out of apartments. It was a testament to Stanley Bard's unique business model, a chaotic visual record of every artist who had ever traded their soul for a month's rent. The building was wearing its history on the inside, a vibrant, sometimes beautiful, often disturbing tapestry woven from the dreams and failures of its inhabitants. It was a machine, all right, but it was a broken, unpredictable, and glorious machine that ran not on oil and electricity, but on human spirit and desperation. The first wave of cultural revolutionaries to fully colonize this strange kingdom was the Beats. In the 1950s, the Chelsea became a key outpost for the writers and poets who were tearing down the staid conventions of post-war American literature. Jack Kerouac, wrestling with the fame that On the Road had brought him, worked on Subterraneans here. Allen Ginsberg and Gregory Corso held court, turning their rooms into smoky dens of literary debate and chemical experimentation. William S. Burroughs, a specter of aristocratic decay, drifted through the hallways, his presence alone a testament to the hotel's tolerance for the extreme. The Beats found in the Chelsea a perfect reflection of their own ethos. It was a place that existed outside the norms of society, a haven for misfits and visionaries. Its shabby grandeur mirrored their own aesthetic of beautiful decay. Its tolerance for chaos provided the freedom they needed to pursue their radical artistic and personal experiments. They filled the hotel with the rhythms of jazz, the frantic energy of benzodrine-fueled typing sessions, and the search for a new kind of consciousness. They were laying the groundwork for the cultural explosion that was to come. They were the advanced scouts, the ones who mapped the strange territory and sent word back to the underground that a sanctuary had been found. The Chelsea was not just a place to sleep. It was a place to hide, to work, to conspire. It was becoming a laboratory for the counterculture, the place where the blueprints for the 1960s were being drafted in a haze of smoke and inspiration. The hotel absorbed their energy, their words, their ghosts, adding another dense layer to its accumulating mythology. The stage was being set for an even more dramatic and consequential act. The 1960s were the turning point, the decade when the Chelsea transformed from a bohemian curiosity into the undisputed epicenter of the counterculture. And it was the arrival of a young folk singer from Minnesota that heralded the change. Bob Dylan moved into room 211 in 1964 with his wife, Sarah. It was here, during a marathon writing session, that he composed some of his most iconic songs, including the sprawling, surreal epic Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands, which would fill an entire side of the album Blonde on Blonde. His presence acted like a magnet, drawing in the entire folk and rock and roll universe. The hotel became the unofficial headquarters of the music revolution. Its hallways, once home to the quiet contemplations of poets, now echoed with the sounds of amplified guitars and furious arguments. It was a place of immense creative pressure. You were not just living in a hotel. You were living inside a legend, surrounded by your heroes and your rivals. Every night was a party, every room a potential collaboration. But this creative furnace had a dark side. The very freedom that made it so fertile also made it incredibly dangerous. There were no boundaries, no rules, no one to tell you to stop. The hotel offered a total escape from the pressures of the outside world, but it offered no escape from the pressures within oneself. For an artist like Dylan, it was a productive retreat. For others, it would become a trap. The Chelsea in the 60s was a grand, intoxicating gamble. It offered the promise of creating a masterpiece, but it also carried the very real risk of becoming another one of its ghosts. Could you walk through this fire and not get burned? The building didn't care. It simply provided the fuel. If Bob Dylan brought the poets and musicians, it was Andy Warhol who brought the freaks, the superstars, and the cameras. Throughout the mid-1960s, the Chelsea became an annex of his famous studio, the Factory. Warhol was fascinated by the hotel's collection of eccentric characters and its atmosphere of faded glamour. He saw it as the perfect stage for his explorations of celebrity, voyeurism, and artifice. He turned his lens on the building and its inhabitants, culminating in his 1966 experimental film, Chelsea Girls. The film, a 3.5-hour, split-screen examination of the lives of several Warhol superstars living in the hotel, was a landmark of underground cinema. It cemented the Chelsea's reputation as a place of raw, unvarnished drama and sexual liberation. The film crew essentially took over parts of the hotel, with figures like Nico, Bridget Berlin, and the tragic Edie Sedgwick holding court in their rooms, their lives dissolving into performance art. With Warhol came a new, more potent strain of the drug culture that had long been present. The amphetamine-fueled energy of the Factory infused the hotel, accelerating its already frantic pace. Heroin, once confined to the jazz and beat scenes, began to gain a wider foothold. The lines between observation and exploitation, always blurry in Warhol's world, became non-existent at the Chelsea. The hotel was no longer just a backdrop for art. It was the subject. Its residents were no longer just tenants. They were characters. And for some, like the beautiful and fragile Edie Sedgwick, who would burn out in a blaze of addiction and mental illness, the role was a terminal one. The Chelsea was now officially a movie set, and everyone was an actor in a film from which there was no escape. The hotel's soundtrack was a symphony of legends. It was in the Chelsea's elevator that a chance encounter between Leonard Cohen and Janis Joplin occurred. A brief, intense liaison that Cohen would later immortalize in the poignant and brutally honest song, Chelsea Hotel No. 2. The song perfectly captures the spirit of the place. A nexus of fleeting connections, artistic ambition, and a deep, underlying loneliness. It wasn't just Cohen and Joplin. Jimi Hendrix was a frequent resident, as was Joni Mitchell, who wrote the song Chelsea Morning about her time in a sun-drenched room, a rare ode to the hotel's lighter, more hopeful side. The members of the Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, and countless other rock luminaries made the hotel their New York base. It was a vertical green room for the entire music industry. But the creative energy was inseparable from the vortex of excess. The concentration of so much talent and so much money in a place with no supervision created a perfect storm of hedonism. Drugs were currency. Sex was casual. The party never stopped. For every Chelsea morning, there was a dozen dark nights of the soul. The pressure to live up to the myth, to be as brilliant and outrageous as the legends in the next room, was immense. And the easiest way to cope with that pressure, to fuel the creative fire or to numb the fear of failure, was to get high. The hotel became a place of dangerous myth-making, where artists were encouraged to live out the rock and roll cliché of living fast and dying young. The building absorbed the music, the pain, and the decadence, its walls silently vibrating with the ghosts of 1,000 unheard songs and 100 broken promises. Amidst the growing chaos of the rock and roll scene, the Chelsea remained a sanctuary for the written word, a testament to the building's strange ability to be all things to all people. Arthur C. Clarke famously wrote his groundbreaking novel, 2001, A Space Odyssey, while living at the hotel, the futuristic vision of HAL 9000 conceived amidst the Victorian decay of his surroundings. The contrast is a perfect metaphor for the Chelsea itself, a place where the past and the future collided. Gore Vidal, Tennessee Williams, and Simone de Beauvoir all spent significant time here, finding in its quiet, thick-walled apartments a refuge from the demands of fame and a space for deep intellectual work. Thomas Wolfe, in an earlier era, had written volumes within its walls. The hotel could be a library as easily as it could be a rock club. Contained multitudes. This duality was its genius and its curse. It was a place where one could retreat from the world to create a masterpiece of intellectual rigor, but to get to your room, you might have to step over a passed-out musician in the hallway. This constant friction between the life of the mind and the life of pure sensation, between disciplined creation and hedonistic abandon, was the hotel's defining characteristic. It asked a fundamental question of its residents. Who are you, and what are you here for? Are you here to work, or are you here to party? Are you here to build a new world on the page, or are you here to burn your own world down? At the Chelsea, both paths were always available, and the choice was left entirely and dangerously up to the individual. But the party could not last forever. The accumulated weight of so much chaos and despair began to take its toll. The glamour of the hotel's bohemian lifestyle began to curdle as the body count rose. The dark side of the myth, long whispered about in the hallways, started to become undeniable. Deaths from drug overdoses, suicides, and accidents became a grimly regular feature of life at the Chelsea. While many were unrecorded or deliberately obscured by management to protect the hotel's reputation, some were too public to ignore. Charles R. Jackson, the author of The Lost Weekend, a harrowing novel about alcoholism, checked into the Chelsea in 1968. He was a man haunted by the same demons he wrote about so brilliantly. He took a fatal dose of barbiturates in his room, a tragic case of life imitating art. His death was a stark reminder that the romance of the tortured artist was a brutal reality for many. The hotel's permissive atmosphere, its status as a place where one could disappear and be left alone, made it an ideal destination for those bent on self-destruction. It offered no safety nets. It asked no questions. Stanley Bard might forgive your rent, but the building itself offered no forgiveness. It was a silent, impartial stage. It would host your greatest triumph or your final, desperate act with the same stoic indifference. The beautiful trap was beginning to show its teeth. The whispers were getting louder. The ghosts were becoming more restless. The Chelsea was no longer just a haven for creativity. It was becoming a synonym for it. The darkness that had been gathering for years finally coalesced and found its ultimate expression in Room 100. In the late summer of 1978, the room was occupied by the figurehead of the punk rock movement, Sid Vicious, the nihilistic bassist of the Sex Pistols, and his girlfriend, Nancy Spungen. Their relationship was a public spectacle of codependent self-destruction, a textbook case of love and addiction spiraling into a black hole. They brought their chaos from London to New York, and the Chelsea, true to form, welcomed them with open arms. Room 100 became their squalid sanctuary. It was a scene of utter dereliction, littered with drug paraphernalia, rotting food, and dirty cash from Sid's sporadic solo gigs. Their days and nights blurred into a monotonous cycle of scoring heroin, getting high, and fighting. They were two deeply damaged, emotionally stunted children, playing out a rock and roll fantasy that had become a grim, pathetic reality. They were isolated, paranoid, and spiraling downward fast. The hotel, which had provided a refuge for so many artists, offered them no solace. Instead, its atmosphere of consequence-free living amplified their worst tendencies. They were completely untethered from reality, adrift in a building that had seen it all and no longer bothered to intervene. The other residents, long accustomed to eccentricity and drama, mostly left them alone, treating them as just another strange act in the hotel's ongoing circus. But this act was reaching its inevitable, tragic finale. The stage was set for the event that would forever stain the Chelsea's legacy. On the morning of October 12, 1978, the mythology of the Hotel Chelsea was shattered by a single, squalid act of violence. Sid Vicious called the front desk, mumbling that something had happened to his girlfriend. Hotel staff entered room 100 to find a scene of grim finality. Nancy Spungen was dead on the bathroom floor, bled out from a single stab wound to her abdomen. She was 20 years old. The murder weapon, a knife Sid had recently purchased, was found in the room. Sid himself was wandering the hallways in a drugged stupor, alternately claiming he couldn't remember what happened and that he had killed her. The police arrived, and the hotel, for so long a private kingdom, was suddenly a public crime scene. The news exploded. The image of a handcuffed Sid Vicious, a pathetic, hollowed-out parody of a rock star, being led from the Chelsea's grand entrance became an iconic symbol of the end of an era. The media frenzy was intense. The hotel was besieged by reporters and photographers, all eager to capture a piece of the sordid tale. The murder of Nancy Spungen was not a romantic rock and roll tragedy. It was a brutal, ugly crime born of drugs, desperation, and mental illness. But it became the definitive event in the Chelsea's dark history. It was the moment the hotel's carefully cultivated aura of dangerous glamour was pierced by a cold, hard, undeniable reality. The fun was over. The party had ended in a pool of blood on a dirty bathroom floor. The building that had nurtured so much life now stood accused of harboring death. The aftermath was a slow, agonizing coda to the punk rock dream. Sid Vicious was charged with murder, sent to Rikers Island, and released on bail put up by his record company. He was a ghost haunting the city, a pariah even in the underground circles that had once celebrated him. His brief, pathetic attempt at a solo career fizzled out in a series of shambolic, drug-fueled concerts. He was lost, broken, and utterly alone, a walking symbol of an entire subculture's self-immolation. The Chelsea tried to move on, to wash the blood from its carpets and its reputation, but the specter of the crime lingered. The story was too lurid, too perfect a symbol of the hotel's dark side, to ever be forgotten. Then, on February 2, 1979, less than 4 months after Nancy's death, the story reached its inevitable conclusion. At a party celebrating his release on bail, Sid Vicious was given a dose of unusually pure heroin. He died of an overdose in his sleep. He was 21 years old. The case against him was closed. The questions surrounding Nancy's death would never be officially answered. For the Chelsea, the twin deaths were a turning point. The freewheeling, anything-goes spirit of the 60s and 70s died with Sid and Nancy. The hotel became infamous, a tourist attraction for those morbidly curious about the crime scene. The creative energy that had defined it for decades began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of weariness and decay. The building had survived, as it always did, but it was now haunted by its most famous and most tragic story, a ghost that would prove impossible to exorcise. The final decades of the 20th century saw the Chelsea enter a long, slow period of decline. The legends of the past were gone, replaced by a new generation of artists who found the hotel's mythology to be more of a burden than an inspiration. The building itself was crumbling, a victim of Stanley Bard's benevolent neglect. The magic was fading, leaving behind only the decay. Then came the new century, and with it, the relentless tide of New York City gentrification. The Chelsea, sitting on a prime piece of Manhattan real estate, was an anomaly, a relic of a bygone era. It was too valuable as property to be allowed to continue as a haven for starving artists. The end came in 2007, when Stanley Bard was unceremoniously forced out by the other shareholders on the board. The man who had been the heart and soul of the hotel for 50 years was gone. The new management had no interest in art or mythology. They were interested in profit. In 2011, the hotel was sold to a real estate developer. The long-term residents, the last vestiges of the Chelsea's bohemian community, were served eviction notices. A bitter, protracted legal battle ensued as the tenants fought to save their homes and the soul of the building. But it was a losing fight. One by one, they were forced out, their life's work packed into boxes, their chaotic, art-filled apartments stripped bare. The sound of construction crews replaced the sound of typewriters and guitars. The building was being gutted. Its history was being power-washed, sanded down, and painted over in a neutral shade of beige. It was the final, most brutal act of violence against the building, the erasure of its memory. Today, the Hotel Chelsea stands reborn. It has been meticulously restored, transformed into a luxury boutique hotel where a single night costs more than many of its former residents paid for a year's rent. The iron balconies are pristine. The lobby is an oasis of minimalist calm. The rooms are beautiful, sterile, and interchangeable with those of any high-end hotel in any major city in the world. The chaos has been tamed. The ghosts have been evicted. The building is finally safe, respectable, and profitable. It is, in essence, the complete and total negation of everything it once was. This transformation is more than just a real estate story. It is a cultural parable. What is the value of a place like the old Chelsea? In a city obsessed with safety, cleanliness, and market value. Is there any room left for the messy, dangerous, and unpredictable process of artistic creation? We claim to value the art that was produced within those walls, the songs, the books, the paintings, but we have systematically destroyed the very environment that made it possible. We want the sanitized myth, not the squalid reality. We want to read about Sid and Nancy, but we don't want to live next door to them. The New Chelsea is a monument to this contradiction. It is a beautiful corpse, perfectly preserved, its rebellious soul having long since departed. It is a mirror held up to our contemporary culture, a culture that prefers its art to be safely framed and its artists to be well-behaved. The fortress Hubert built to protect creativity has become a gilded cage, its wild, untamable spirit finally broken. We end where we began, on the rain-slicked pavement of West 23rd Street, staring up at the facade. The building stands silent, impassive. It has outlasted them all. It outlasted Hubert's utopian dream, Bard's chaotic kingdom, the Beats, the Warhol superstars, the rock gods, and the punks. It has survived bankruptcy, murder, and now its own gentrification. A taxi pulls up to the curb, and a well-dressed couple emerges, handing their bags to a uniformed doorman. They pass under the red neon sign and disappear into the quiet lobby, oblivious to the ghosts they are displacing. The building accepts them as it accepted all the others. Did the hotel create the genius? Did its unique atmosphere of freedom and neglect act as a catalyst for great art? Or was it simply a stage, a cheap, tolerant, and convenient backdrop for a uniquely American drama of ambition and self-destruction that would have unfolded anyway? Perhaps the truth is that the building was a vessel. It contained the roiling, contradictory energies of the 20th century and gave them a home. It didn't create anything, but it allowed everything to happen. It was a space of pure potential for good and for ill. And now that space is gone. The neon sign casts a lonely red glow on the wet street, the last light of a dead star. The building keeps its secrets. It has been emptied of its stories, but the walls, if you listen closely enough in the dead of night, still remember every single one.